Hey y'all, Dustin here. Conference expansion has dominated the talk of the college football world for the last decade or so. But one conference in particular has bucked the trends when it comes to expanding to add teams. I'm of course talking about the Big 12. In 2010, the Big 12 had 12 teams. Makes sense, right? Then, in 2011, they lost Nebraska and Colorado. So the 2011 season, the Big 12 played with 10 teams, while the Big 10 played with 12 teams. Makes sense, right? Then, in 2012, they lost Missouri and Texas A&M to the SEC. So they were basically back to being the Big 8. So they added TCU and West Virginia and got back up to be the Big 12 with 10 teams, although now the Big 10 played with 14 teams. Because nothing makes sense. In January of this year, the NCAA adopted a rule change that allows conferences with less than 12 teams to have a conference championship game matching the two top-ranked teams, assuming that they play in a round-robin type schedule, which the Big 12 does. So there you have it. No more expansion. The Big 12 is set. Right? Not exactly. You see, the Big 12 can't survive long-term with a conference setup and scheduling like the one they have. And many people think that they need to add at least 2 teams to make the conference more stable going forward. So today we're going to take a look at a list of candidates alphabetically. We're going to weigh the pros and cons for each one and come away with the teams that the Big 12 should add in conference expansion. First, we're going to start with the Appalachian State Mountaineers. Yes, the same Appalachian State team that has only been in the FBS for 2 years now. But they bring so much more than that. This team has won 3 straight FCS championships within the last decade. They have had 9 NFL draft picks in the last 8 years. They have a crazy dedicated fan base. And oh yeah, they had that little-known win over Michigan in 2007. This move would add North Carolina to the Big 12 footprint. And this team is in Boone, which is far away from Tobacco Road. You would not have a competing market. You may even get some Charlotte markets out of it. Plus, it gives West Virginia the most natural football rivalry they could ever have. Mountaineers versus Mountaineers. The big con is that the stadium, Kid Brewer Stadium, currently only holds 22,000 people, although they've had as many as 31,000 in there. But they would surely expand the stadium with Big 12 money. While I mentioned maybe getting into Charlotte, you're going to be in Boone, and Boone is not a very large market at all. And even though they went 11-2 last year, they are only 2 seasons removed from the FCS, from Division I AA. No matter how good you were last year, do you really want to jump within 2 years from playing Furman to playing Oklahoma and TCU and Texas? Jumping into a big conference too early might hurt your program long term. Just look at West Virginia. We all thought that they would be doing much better than they are in the conference. It just takes some time to adjust. Next up, we have the Boise State Broncos. Come on, Big 12. You are very familiar with Boise State. This team is probably the biggest loser in the whole conference realignment fiasco that's gone on. They deserve a really good home, and the Big 12 could be that home. Over the past decade, Boise State has proven to be one of the hottest teams in the country. Even casual football fans would turn into the Big 12 network to watch them play. This football team also has the distinction of being the winningest football program over the last decade, over Alabama, Ohio State, Oklahoma. The problem is, they're pretty far away from every other college in this conference. And that's a problem that West Virginia is dealing with, and Boise State for a lot of them would be almost as far, if not a little bit further. Also, Boise is the 111th media market in the country, and it's located in the 39th most populated state. As far as numbers go, it doesn't bring a whole lot to the network. Honestly, they just fit in better with the Pac-12. But teams fitting better into conferences has not changed conference alignment so far. That's why Maryland is now in the Big 10, which makes no sense. Next up, we have the BYU Cougars. Whether you want to admit it or not, BYU is just one of those brands, those rare, enigmatic brands that can actually stand alone as an independent and for the most part be fine. They have a history and tradition of winning. They've been in 11 straight bowl games. They have great rivalries. They give you a Utah market, and Mormons love BYU. They have a built-in fan base, and I've been told that Notre Dame is to Catholics what BYU is to Mormons. If that is true at all, they would be a great addition as far as eyeballs on a Big 12 network. Really, the only con for this team is that they're unwilling to play sports on Sundays due to their religious beliefs, which is fine for football, but for all the other sports like volleyball and baseball, that would pose a problem. But honestly, they've been in conferences before. I'm sure the Big 12 could gladly work around that. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bearcats. Honestly, I think Cincinnati's one of those programs that just needs a chance. I don't really think they're ever going to be a national championship contender, although Brian Kelly got them really close when he was there. But you can't tell me that this team won't fit into the Kansas State, Texas Tech kind of a role in the conference, and make some noise and have some say in who gets in the Big 12 championship game. This university is dying to be in the Big 12, and it gives West Virginia a natural border rivalry in the East. Mountaineers, wouldn't it be nice to drive to a conference game for once? I mean, I know it's 4.5 hours away, but that's a hell of a lot closer than Austin, Texas. Adding the Bearcats gets the Big 12 the 35th largest market in the country, as well as a footprint in football-crazy Ohio. The problem with Cincinnati is that the city will always be a pro sport city. It will always belong to the Bengals and the Reds. And this team will never be able to truly get the city to really rally behind them the way that, say, Austin, Texas, or Houston will behind their teams. But other than that, I'm not sure I can really find a con with this move. I think it makes a lot of sense. Next up, we have the UConn Huskies. Wait. Please don't walk away. Yes, I'm putting them in here. Remember, this is a team 5 years ago that somehow found itself playing in the Fiesta Bowl. I'm going to very confidently and purposely pretend that they give the Big 12 an access into the New York City market. I mean, they don't. They're like 2 hours away, and I don't really think anybody in New York cares about Connecticut. But it sounds nice. Now, I'm only putting them in here because this is a name that I've seen floating around. I think if you're expanding your brand into other sports, notably basketball, UConn makes a lot of sense. But other than that, as far as football goes, they do not have a great tradition of history. They've only been in 6 bowl games in their entire existence. The more I think about it, the sorrier I am that I even brought it up to begin with. The next team on this list is the Houston Cougars. The Houston Cougars. Your team name is really hard for me to say. The Big 12 adding Houston is literally the most logical move in the history of logical moves as far as conference alignment is concerned. They have natural rivals with all of the Texas schools. They're coming off a 13-1 season in which they won a New Year's Six game against the team that won a national championship 2 years ago. And they have a 42,000-person student body. That is a lot of alumni to continuously pump into the world that will watch the Big 12 network. They also have quietly been the 20th winningest program of the last decade. The problem for Houston is that conference alignment nowadays doesn't make sense in all of the ways that it used to. This is a business decision, and unfortunately for the University of Houston, it doesn't make a lot of business sense to add them. Texas is already Big 12's home base. They only added TCU because they would have been really stupid if they didn't scoop in and get it. Houston just isn't to TCU's level yet. It's just not a new market. It doesn't add any new eyeballs in the state of Texas to the Big 12 network. In 1986, this would have made perfect sense. Just not in 2016, which is really sad. Next up, we have the Memphis Tigers. They are coming off a great season, and if they were added, the Big 12 would get the Western Tennessee market, as well as some spillover into Mississippi, Arkansas, and maybe Missouri. It's close enough that most of the current teams in the Big 12 could travel to pretty easily, and it's far enough from that other team in Knoxville that seems to dominate the state. Memphis could really carve out the entire western part of the state for themselves with a little bit more money and influence. They have a decent tradition for winning, as well as a stadium capacity of over 60,000 people. Also, FedEx, which is based in Memphis, has already openly said that they would gladly sponsor a Big 12 championship game. So what are the cons? Well, they did have a hot team last year, but Fuentes has gone to Virginia Tech, so who knows how they'll be going forward. Also, they're sub 500 all-time in wins, as in they have lost more games than they've won as a program. But to be honest with you, I think the pros far outweigh the cons in this case. The North Dakota State Bison. Oh yeah, it's about time this team gets a shot at the big leagues. They have an absolutely rabid fan base. Do you not remember when College Game Day was in Fargo? They have won 5 straight national championships, which is almost impossible to do at any level of any sport, let alone football. They beat an FBS team every single year since 2010, except for last year when they didn't play one, but probably would have beat them anyway. That list includes Big 12 teams Iowa State, Kansas State, and Kansas. But here's the thing. Fargo is a really small market, and the Fargo Dome holds 19,000 people. It's a dome, so it probably isn't that expandable. Iowa State would be the only team relatively close to them, and it could be a gamble going from FCS straight to the Big 12 where you're playing Oklahoma and TCU. At least Appalachian State has had 2 years to adjust, and they've already played in a bowl game. Last, but probably not least, we have the UCF Central Florida Knights. UCF is in Florida, where every conference in the country probably wants to get its grubby little hands into. And Orlando is one of the big ones, 18th in the country. This team has had recent success as well, capping off a 12-1 season in 2013 by beating Baylor in the Fiesta, as well as winning 2 straight American Conference titles. Although 2 years ago, this expansion would have looked a hell of a lot better than it does right now, before UCF went winless last year and lost their coach. Is a team that's rebuilding really the type of program you want to bring into a major conference like this? Plus, getting into the Florida market sounds nice, but they're never going to be the kind of players that Florida State, and Miami are. They're just not. So, after weighing the pros and cons of each team on this list, I think it's time that I make my decision of who the Big 12 should add. Drum roll, please. And my first pick is the BYU Cougars. They've been talked about for over 5 years now. It's just time. If they can survive as an independent, which they have been able to do, they're going to fit right in to the Big 12, as will the Cincinnati Bearcats, which is my second pick. Now you have 12 teams, and you can go back to the traditional North-South matchups. You're going to have the 4 Texas schools, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State in the South, and every other team in the North. But what if you didn't stop at 12? What if you decided to go the route that the Big Ten and the SEC and the ACC did and decided to add 4 more teams to get to 14? Well, in that case, I think you need to talk about adding Memphis and Appalachian State. You could move the Tigers to the south since they're relatively close to Texas and Oklahoma, and you could put Appalachian State with their brand new rivals in the north in West Virginia. So that is what I would do. I would add those 4 teams and have that division set up, have a conference championship game at Jerry World every year, and make it a big old party. And welcome back to the rest of the conference's Big 12. You're no longer a leper. But say that the Big 12 went full-on loony. Say they decided to be the first conference since the WAC in the 90s to go to 16 teams. What other 2 teams should they add? I'm going to go with North Dakota State and UCF. I know, Houston and Boise fans, I know you're mad. I just think that Boise is a better fit in the Pac-12. They're closer there, they have more in common with those teams. And Houston, again, financially it doesn't make sense to add you. You don't really add anything new to the conference. Although, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to make my list of how I would have done conference alignment from the start so we could have escaped all of this mess. And you will be with your Texas brethren because I think that's where you deserve to be. Unfortunately, you're just not going to be, at least in the Big 12. So that is how I would do the Big 12's conference alignment. Tell me, do you agree? Do you disagree? Who would you put in? Make sure to leave a comment down below with your top 6 teams in order that you would add, in case they went to 12, 14, or 16. If you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up. Every single one of those helps. Every single one of those makes me smile. And if you want to see videos like this every Saturday up until the college football season on different college football topics, make sure to hit that red subscribe button and leave me a comment saying what other topics you want me to talk about, and maybe they can become videos in the future. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I hope it wasn't too long for you and you could kind of follow along with what I was saying. And as always, until next time. The conference setup and scheduling like the one they have. And many people think that they need to add at least 2 teams to make the conference more stable going forward. So today we're going to take a look at a list of candidates alphabetically. We're going to weigh the pros and cons for each one and come away with the teams that the Big 12 should add in conference to have a conference championship game matching the 2 top-ranked teams, assuming that they play in a round-robin type schedule, which the Big 12 does. So there you have it. No more expansion. The Big 12 is set. Right? Not exactly. You see, the Big 12 can't survive long-term back to being the Big 8. So they added TCU and West Virginia and got back up to be the Big 12 with 10 teams. Although now the Big 10 played with 14 teams. Because nothing makes sense. In January of this year, the NCAA adopted a rule change that allows conferences with less than 12 teams. Then, in 2011, they lost Nebraska and Colorado. So the 2011 season, the Big 12 played with 10 teams, while the Big 10 played with 12 teams. Makes sense, right? Then, in 2012, they lost Missouri and Texas A&M to the SEC. So they were basically back. Hey y'all, Dustin here. Conference expansion has dominated the talk of the college football world for the last decade or so. But one conference in particular has bucked the trend when it comes to expanding to add teams. I'm of course talking about the Big 12. In 2010, the Big 12 had 12 teams. Makes sense, right?